They often say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, but today's video might be the exception to this rule. A Norfolk-born man, born into a well-off family, who, while his father would go from strength to strength in the world of politics in Georgian Norwich, he would fall, going from failed job to failed job, until an act of brutality and revenge would see him sentenced to what at the time was considered a fate worse than death. John Thurtell was born on the 21st of December 1794, a few miles outside the city of Norwich. Compared to the general poverty in the countryside at the time, John was born into a family living comfortably. His mother, Susanna, little can be found of now, but his father, Thomas, was a successful merchant, member of the city council, and also serving as alderman of Norwich, with no doubt his eyes on the next job title and the top slot he could go for, mayor of the city. John was the second of several children born to the couple, and not only was he his father's heir, his older brother having died while he was an infant, it soon became clear that he was by far the favourite of the family. Also, while he grew, it was noted that he was a rather impulsive and hard to control child, and it would be a mix of these two factors that would lead to John being educated locally, rather than being sent away to a boarding school, as was done with other of his siblings, and very popular among families of his class at the time. It should come as no shock that he was not much better behaved when he was at school, and didn't take well to education, performing poorly in all academic subjects. His only passion came from competitive sports, his favourites being horse racing, and one that would play a larger role in his life and ultimately start him on the path to his undoing, prize fighting, with him being involved in the early world of boxing when he was still in his early teens. It was through this that he met one of Norfolk's most famous sons, and a lover of all things boxing, George Borrow, who we have covered on this channel before. Borrow, it seems, did not take well to young John, who was around 14 years old at this time, and certainly did not like his behaviour, commenting that in his teen years he was not adverse to tying canisters to dogs' tails, and later on describing him. The terrible Thurtell was present, lord of the concourse, for wherever he moved he was master, and when he spoke, even when in chains, every other voice was silent. He stood on the med, grim and pale as usual, with his bruises around. John would also be summed up more recently by the local historian Stephen Carver as a dandy with a rough edge. If strangers like George Borrow didn't like the actions of John, his family was outright horrified by the life their favourite son had chosen, and somewhere between the poor performance in school, the hours spent at the races, and his fights, both in and out of the ring, I'm sure they were at their wits' end as he became more and more the black sheep of the family. So if life on land was not going to make John a respectable adult, maybe one at sea would. So, at the age of 15, he was packed off to Chatham on the 8th of May, 1809, to serve as a second lieutenant in Company 99 of the Royal Marines, a commission bought for him by his father. By now, Britain was heavily embroiled in the Napoleonic Wars across the world, and had seen a huge growth in its armed forces. The Royal Marines alone had gone from a couple of thousand strong to a force of tens of thousands. After a short period of training, John was assigned aboard HMS Adamant, a 50-gun, fourth-rate ship that it's fair to say had seen a lot of ups and downs in its career. It had seen action during the American Revolution at Cape Henry and the Chesapeake, and in 1797 it had been involved in the Nore Mutiny. It had fought the Dutch and fought the French in more recent years, serving as far as the Indian Ocean. But by the time John stepped on board, it was very different. HMS Adamant was now a receiving ship, where newly joined sailors were sent before moving on to the ships that needed them. Among these recruits was a large number of impressed men, who had been picked up by press gangs from local pubs and taverns from many of the port cities of Britain. It was the duty of the Marines on board to keep these men in line until they were moved off. And John, already known for his short temper and his willingness to use his fists to get his way, must have found this a task that fit him well. In the grand scheme of things, John would have found little time to find his feet and his sea legs, and settle into what must have seemed like a very boring life on HMS Adamant, when suddenly everything changed dramatically. It all began with the arrival of Captain John Sykes, and soon the Adamant was being recommissioned. Initially, due to its age, it had been designated unfit for battle, but now the need of ships was greater, so she was being called into action once again. Command was handed over Captain Matthew Buckle, she sailed off towards the Netherlands and the Scheldt operation. The Scheldt operation, or Volcrum campaign, was fought in hopes of capturing the port of Antwerp and opening a new front in Europe to aid the beleaguered Austrians. It would fail on both counts, and in its 5 months would achieve nothing for the British, despite landing more troops there than were fighting in Portugal and Spain. It would be nothing but a slog through bad weather, with very little actual fighting taking place. But the expeditionary force hit with wave after wave of sickness. When the British finally accepted defeat and retreated in December 1809, they had suffered over 4,000 dead, of which only 106 had been killed in action. The rest had succumbed to the weather conditions, malaria, typhus, typhoid and dysentery, with a further 12,000 evacuated sick during the campaign. In terms of losses, the French and Dutch forces did not come off much better. Today the battle is largely remembered as one of the few times men of the Irish Legion of the French army directly fought the British. Unfortunately, the details of John's military service have been largely lost to the winds of time, so we know nothing about his time during the campaign, and we only have the very broad strokes from the ships he served on. We can't even use the stories he told in later life as any real indication, because, as you will see, he was no stranger to exaggeration of his time in uniform. What we do know is that for all his family's hopes, being placed in the King's service did little to make him a better man, as, on the 16th of July 1811, Lieutenant Thurtell was standing before Rear Admiral William Albany Otway on a charge of misconduct, for which he was found guilty and discharged from serving aboard HMS Adamant. The next few months of his life are largely a mystery, possibly spent languishing around Portsmouth, waiting for a new ship to accept him. This period of time would last until the 11th of November 1811, when he was finally signed aboard HMS Bellona, another ageing vessel whose best years were now long behind her. His career on HMS Bellona would be far from an interesting one. As an older vessel no longer fit to take part in intense fighting, they mostly spent their war escorting convoys, blockading French and Dutch ports, and when not doing this they were generally anchored off the Isle of Wight. The closest they would come to action was sailing past the Spanish city of San Sebastian, a few days after it fell to Anglo-Portuguese forces in September 1813. And then one day, a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon. A lone French schooner. As the men were beat to quarters, you can almost imagine John ready to lead his marines in a boarding action that he'd waited for so long. The ship, though, would turn out to be an unarmed French merchant vessel, who, upon seeing the 74-gun third-rate ship of the line bearing down upon her, surrendered without a shot fired. John would linger on in the Royal Marines until the June of the following year, and the ending of this stage of the Napoleonic Wars, when he resigned his commission and returned to Norwich, where he soon became a well-known feature in the public houses across the city, and given his attitude, mixed with no doubt the drinks he was being bought by fascinated locals, he began to embellish his military career. No longer had he simply sailed past San Sebastian, no, he had played a part in the storming itself, charging through the breach as men fell around him. And that simple schooner, taken without incident, well, it was now a brig of war, taken in a frantic boarding action, fought with pistol and sword, until the French crew were forced to throw down their weapons. And I'm sure it was told in such a way that made Nelson's boarding of the San Joseph during the Battle of Cape St. Vincent seem like child's play. John had rebuilt his relationship with Norwich's boxing community soon after he returned, but now, with his time spent in the city's pubs, he had been brought into contact with more and more aspects of it, and in many ways you can see this as the beginning of his downfall. Among his new circle of friends was a man we will cover in future, Ned Flatnose Painter, the bare-knuckled boxer who was landlord of the Anchor in Lobster Lane. His father once again railed against the life his son was devolving into, and was determined to try and make a respectable man out of him, going as far as buying him a bonsamine-making business, a type of twisted dress fabric of silk or cotton. It was a black kind of formal wear used mostly in mourning clothes, and he bought this for him for his 21st birthday. Thomas didn't even expect him to run the business alone. Rather, it would be a joint venture between John, his younger brother, also named Thomas, their father, and another man named John Gibbons. It wasn't just employment that Thomas tried to save his son with. also setting him up with a young Quaker girl from a respectable family as a sweetheart. This idyllic Georgian middle-class life would not last long for John, and soon the wheels were starting to come off. Firstly, he was not a man who took to hard work, frequently missing work to spend time in the public houses or the boxing rings, either watching or fighting himself at times. Even trying his hand at boxing promotion at this time, with his first matches taking part around this time. He'd do several, all of them held through Ned Painter, including a large one that was held in North Walsham on the 17th of July, 1820. Becoming more and more well known in the Norwich boxing world, both the legal and illegal side of it. John was soon being invited to join the larger world of underground boxing down in London. Journeying to the capital would only bring out the worst in John, especially when he was not treated with the level of respect he had come to know. Despite his family connections through his father and his own largely middle-class lifestyle, he was seen as something of a country bumpkin to the Londoners, often made the butt of jokes and greeted with snide comments and accusations that he did not take kindly to. For example, at one boxing event where he was a spectator, the man next to him accused him of being a countryside pickpocket. In a heartbeat, John launched at him, badly beating him. And things were not going much better back home in Norwich. Through a mix of his neglect and disinterest, his own business was soon spiralling towards bankruptcy, with John in a rather interesting position. Through various ventures, both legitimate and far more shady, he was owed a great deal of money, but in turn, both professionally and privately, was in a huge amount of debt. The solution seems quite simple. Collect one load of money to pay off the other. But as you can probably guess, John's debtors were about as likely to pay him back as he would be. So he hatched a little plan, to either gain him some more time to pay, or maybe convince some of the more light-hearted lenders to let his debt slide. John had apparently spent some time going around collecting the money he had been owed, and was just returning home when he received a message to call on a Mr. Bolingbroke, a friend of the family, who lived in the Chapelfield area of the city. Not wanting to keep him waiting, John left the house again. While on his way there, a woman fell in next to him, and the pair talked for a few minutes as they walked along, when suddenly John was attacked from behind by three men. In the scuffle, John was hit a few times, and all of the money he was carrying was stolen. He appealed in the local paper, offering a £100 reward for any information that would lead to an arrest of this group of thieves. But nothing ever came of it, and it soon became clear that the event probably never happened, as John had rather over-egged the pudding when it came to the story. The wounds he was proudly showing off around the city seemed to many to look self-inflicted, and the amount of money he claimed had been stolen from him, £1,508, an amount that today would total to £117,560.73, was an insane amount of money for anyone to be carrying around with them, especially someone who was aware of the city's more criminal side. If John had hoped this story would have got him spoken about around the city for a while, he was right. But if he hoped it would dismiss his creditors, he was very, very wrong. They didn't believe the tale for a moment, and within a few weeks, along with his business partners, they were forced to declare bankruptcy. The creditors' meeting taking place from the 15th to the 17th of March, 1821, in the Norfolk Hotel. John, though, was not about to face the music. He packed up a few necessities, left his Quaker sweetheart, and along with a new woman named Mary Dobson, who he'd probably been seeing on the side for some time, fled from Norwich to London, leaving many creditors, among them his own father, who it seemed he owed the largest sum of money to, high and dry. In London, in hopes to distance himself from his past, John took to using the name Jack, and if he had kept on a somewhat straight and narrow, it's possible that he could have led a pretty comfortable life, after obtaining a licence to run a public house in Longacre. But it wasn't long before he was working with his brother Thomas again, and the pair reunited were clearly a bad influence on each other. And John was soon scamming again, taking Thomas with him on many of these. Many of these at the beginning were small and relatively harmless, but as is always the case, they grew bigger and bigger, until they got the idea to make some serious money. Although in truth how much of these Thomas was fully aware of is rather unclear. He never really left Norfolk, and only visited John occasionally, who seemed to have been using his brother's name for credit reasons frequently. And this is probably why both names were on the certificate that bought a warehouse, and insured it for £1,900, £182,421.83 today, that they then apparently started to fill with bonsamine and other fabrics. And when they had enough, they sold their stock for cash, only for the warehouse to tragically burn down on the 26th of January 1823, before the clothes' new owners could come and collect. During the investigation, the insurance company soon discovered there was no evidence that bonsamine or any other fabric had ever been stored there, and the claim was soon dismissed. The brothers did sue the company and did technically win, but its managing director refused to budge, even threatening to countersue and launch a criminal investigation on the pair. After this, they were forced to accept defeat and were left effectively destitute. It also seems that around this time, Mary Dobson made herself scarce as well. I think it's also worth to note that Thomas really did not need his brother's help in making bad deals and financial decisions, as he, off his own back, ended up spending 14 months in debtor's prison from March 1822. Having once again taken another fall down the rungs of respectability, John drifted around London, mixing with more and more of the criminal element, buying and failing to run a number of pubs and taverns. Eventually he moved in with a man named William Probert and his family for a while, a former convict and failed wine merchant. John took to William very well, and the pair became good friends, often drinking together, and they were soon joined by Joseph Hunt, 26 years old pub landlord, totally illiterate but a very talented singer, and he, like them, was a mix of has-been and never was, spending what little money they could scrape together in pubs, on card games, the billiards tables, cockfighting and horse races. Unknown to them, the areas they were frequenting were the hunting grounds of another man, William Weir, 43 years old, a solicitor by profession, but also a card and billiard shark, with the connections to several criminal gangs. He had started to take notice of these newcomers, and saw, especially in John, easy pickings, and all he had to do was bide his time and wait. If William Weir only ever made two mistakes in his life, they both involved John Thurtell, the day he crossed him and the day he trusted him. The first took place in October 1823, and for William it started as a good few days. He left his home in Lyons Inn, off the Strand, dressed smartly as always, as this particular time he was off to the horse racing in Doncaster, so he went north for a few days to enjoy himself. Upon his return, with his pockets filled with his winnings, and in high spirits, he thought he would top his day off by taking some money from some unsuspecting victim at the card tables. Upon entering one of his haunts, he was met by a member of a local gang he was friendly with, who pointed out some poor sap with a Norfolk twang to his accent, who was having a pretty bad day. William smiled and went over to the table, taking a seat across from John Thurtell, ready for the game to begin. Like all good card sharks, William played John just as much as he played the game itself. He was friendly and courteous with him, letting him win some rounds and lose others, to build John's confidence but not make him suspicious, before reeling him in with the idea of playing a final game for some real money. John agreed, and the trap was set. Although, on a slight side tangent here, despite the picture being painted, I think it's important to remember that although William was described as a card shark, it is entirely possible that these games were being won and lost fairly. Exactly what cards are dealt is now unknown, but the outcome is not. William took John for everything he had, leaving him in a debt of £300. It would be £28,803.45 today. The most shocking bit of the outcome is that it seems John controlled his anger at that very moment, and the pair parted as amicably as possible. But he was soon claiming that William had cheated him out of his money, and he would get revenge. Maybe John found out who William was that night, or maybe he only found out the truth in the coming days. But along with William Probert and Joseph Hunt, they began to plot revenge. He remained friendly with William in the upcoming days, often being seen with him, before inviting him to join him and the others on a weekend of hunting and gambling they were planning, in the countryside, in the village of Radlett in Hertfordshire, where Probert lived. William accepted, a rather strange thing for him to have done, as it said he's a man who didn't trust people easily. Maybe he just saw John as totally harmless, but he had made his second and final mistake. When the day to set off came round, Thurtell, Probert and Hunt hired a horse-drawn gig for transport, Thurtell already owned one of his own. Loading one with a large sack and a length of rope, John then went off to buy a pair of pistols, before going off to collect William from his lodgings in Lyon's Inn, one of the inns of Chancery, well known for being where the worst lawyers resided. He met them without a care in the world, bringing a gun and a spare change of clothes with him. John invited him to share his gig on the journey, while William Probert and Joseph Hunt followed in the second. They didn't make any real haste to their location, stopping at several taverns along the way. And as for William, the upcoming weekend must have looked like it was just as much about drinking as it was going to be about hunting. When they arrived in Radlett, they turned up Gills Hill Lane, heading towards the cottage owned by Probert. What exactly unfolded in the next couple of minutes is not clear. The stories told later do contradict each other slightly. As they neared the location, William Weir either dismounted from the gig for some reason, or was still sitting next to John. Either way, he would only have realised the danger he was in when a mechanical click grabbed his attention. Turning to see what it was, he saw John, still seated, aiming at him with a Queen Anne-style flintlock pistol. Before William could react, John fired, hitting him in the face but not killing him. The pistol ball glanced off his cheekbone, as it seems the pistol misfired, possibly due to a lack of powder. An injured William staggered down the lane trying to flee for his life, but in his delirious state John soon caught up with him, using the handle of the pistol to beat him to the floor and then beat him to death, before taking a knife from his jacket and cutting William's throat from ear to ear to make sure the job had been done right, leaving him to bleed out on the floor. Possibly as they'd been making their journey, Probert and Hunt had started to get cold feet about the whole thing, and had started to lag behind John, as by the time they caught up, William was already dead. They would help, though, when Weir's body was placed into the sack and tied up, and dumped under a nearby hedge. But not before they rifled through his pockets for any valuables he might have, coming to the grand total of £15, £1,440.17 today, a gold watch and chain, and a few loose coins. When this was done, they made their way to the cottage to await for nightfall. When darkness fell, and they were sure no one was going to be around to see them, they returned to the site of the killing, to move the body to what they hoped would be a more permanent hiding place. A pond nearby was chosen, but as they were lowering William's body into the cold water, a sudden realization and horror struck John like a thunderbolt. In all the excitement since pulling that trigger, he had no idea what had happened to both his knife and pistol. He rushed back to Gills Hill Lane and searched the length of it several times, but in the darkness found nothing. With their terrible deed done, the three returned to the cottage where William Probert's wife had been making them dinner, who also appears to have been totally oblivious of anything that was going on, with Probert even gifting her a gold chain he had taken from William's body. They ate dinner, laughed, and sang the night away, but their hopes of getting away were not to be. As the sun rose the next day, two workmen arrived at Gills Hill Lane to clear some of the bushes away from the roadside. Their morning's work was disturbed when they found what John had been searching for with no avail: a recently fired pistol and a blood-covered knife. Both items were soon handed over to their employer, a Mr. Nichols. For reasons known only to himself, Nichols was to keep this discovery to himself for a couple of days, and had it been the only connection to the killing, it's likely John and his accomplices would have got away scot-free. If there's one thing that hasn't changed in the last 200 years when it comes to village life, is that nothing truly goes unnoticed, and locals love to talk, and such was the case in Radlett the following day. While the workmen were handing over their grim discovery, elsewhere people were talking about a lone gunshot the evening before, strange gigs coming into the village, and word soon reached William Probert, who was mostly worried when a local farmer told him he'd heard the pistol shot the night before, and seen strange activity around a local pond, and was also sure it wouldn't be long until law enforcement were getting involved. The pond they had dumped the body in was not very far from William's home at all. This revelation sent Probert hurrying back towards London to find his friends who had left some time before, with the three returning that night to move the corpse to a far safer location. In this case, a different pond, some miles away in Elstree. There doesn't seem to be a single thing that cracked this open and started the investigation. Rather, little bits of information coming to light all around at the same time that doomed John. First was the talk around the village. Second was Mr. Nichols deciding to turn in the blood-covered knife and pistol over to a magistrate on the 28th. who, in turn, decided whatever was happening was beyond his powers, and sent to London to alert the Bow Street runners, a forerunner of the Metropolitan Police. Word of this discovery was great news to the authorities in London, who had recently been informed of the apparent disappearance of William Weir, and were very interested in the three men he was last seen with, at least two of whom were now acting very strangely. Probert was like a coiled spring, constantly on edge and jumpy at the slightest thing, and Hunt, a man who took pride in his beard and moustache, was now inexplicably clean-shaven. The ongoing investigation was also inadvertently aided by John's need to always be as flash as possible. The gig he had hired that day, of all the horses he could choose from, he had to go for the most distinctive one, an iron-grey horse with a white face. Such a distinctive-looking animal had obviously stuck in the minds of many people, and made it easy to trace the group's path all the way up to the village, and brought a magistrate to Probert's cottage, who initially was just there to ask some general questions about him, his friends, and their hunting weekend with the now missing Weir. But discovering that Probert was packing his bags ready to leave the area, raised more questions than he could ever have answered. And it was more than the magistrate needed to get warrants issued for the arrest of the three men and John's younger brother Thomas, who had been hanging around with them recently as well. It would be William Probert and Thomas Thurtell the first to be arrested, just 5 days after the killing. Then it was Thomas Hunt, who when arrested was actually wearing the clothes the victim had brought with him to change into. The final to fall was John himself, taken in his lodgings at the Coach and Horses in Conduit Street in Mayfair. After a short search of his room, blood-stained clothes were found, as well as a pistol that John surrendered to the police as they entered. The four captives were taken to the Essex Arms where a petty sessions was being held, and it did not take long for whatever alliance existed between these four to crumble. All knew they were staring into oblivion at the end of a hangman's rope, and as you can imagine, this was not a fate they simply wished to walk into. Both Hunt and Probert turned on John, both agreeing not only to give evidence against him, but to reveal where the body of Weir had been hidden. So with their help, the body of William was pulled from its watery grave and examined by Dr. Ward and Dr. Kendall of Watford, with an autopsy and inquest being held in the Artichoke Public House in Elstree, a pub that still largely exists today, although part of it has been rebuilt after a fire. Despite the condition of the body after its time in the water, they are able to attest that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. It had shattered the skull and driven a fragment of bone into the brain. The murder weapon was also determined to most likely have been the blood-covered pistol found in the lane the day after the killing. While this grisly task was being undertaken in one pub, back in another, the Essex Arms, the questioning of the suspects was underway. Not that it had been very difficult to get information out of them, especially Hunt, who had turned fully on his former friend and was telling them everything they needed to know, from where John had bought the pair of pistols and how much it had cost him, £1 17 shillings and 6 pence, to where they had hired the horses and gigs for their journey, even detailing the pubs they had stopped in on their way there. One of them was none other than the Artichoke in Elstree, where William now lay lifeless. Joseph Hunt had not witnessed the killing himself, but he was able to tell them much more about the aftermath, seeing John taking the gold watch from the victim, and how he gloated he'd done it because William had stolen £300 from him in cards. Before, they dumped the body and divided up his belongings, and that's how he came to be wearing a dead man's clothes at the time of his arrest. When Hunt's testimony was done, next came Probert, who, as his friends had done, laid much of the blame on John, while absolving himself of whatever he could. Again saying he'd played no part in the murder itself, but had cleaned up the mess and stolen from the victim. As you can imagine then, by the time John himself was called in to be questioned, he had a great deal of work to do in order to save himself. Something that he failed at spectacularly, almost from the very start. When asked about the pistols, he dismissed it, saying it was rubbish, he'd never owned a pistol in his life. To which it was then pointed out he had one in his coat pocket when he was arrested, one that also clearly came from a matching set of the one found in Gills Hill Lane. From here, the questions only spiralled down into a mix of lies and contradictions, leaving the authorities in no doubt they had the right man. They were taken to Hertford Jail to await their murder trial. Around this time, it also seems that John's brother was let go, clearly not involved in the case at all. They would spend 3 months in the confine of the jail, each protesting his innocence, trying to pass the blame onto one or both of the others. Unknown to them, but while they were languishing, this case had become quite the talking point around the country, and the story was being told and retold in papers from Portsmouth to Glasgow, becoming a sensation due to the rather low rates of murders of this kind in the country at the time. Of course, violence and murder within gangs was incredibly common and epidemic in the cities, but someone from John's social standing, much was made of him being the son of an alderman, was almost unheard of for them to be accused of a killing. There was even a short rhyme that sprung up. They cut his throat from ear to ear, his head they battered in. His name was Mr. William Weir, he lived in Lyon's Inn. The great interest in the case also brought a huge attention to William's burial. Once the doctors had finished with him and his autopsy, he was buried in the churchyard of St. Nicholas Parish Church in Elstree. The local authorities had him buried at night, wishing to keep the fuss to a minimum. But as soon as word got out, hundreds of people came from the local area to witness it. The trial finally started on the 6th of January 1824 at the Hertford Assizes Court. The judge was Sir James Allen Park, and the foreman of the jury was none other than William Lamb, the future Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. From the start of the trial, it was clear it was going to be a messy affair, and in all honesty, the verdict was pretty much decided before any evidence had been heard. The construction of the gallows had started days before, with James Park even saying, "If these statements of evidence before the trial, which corrupt the purity of the administration of justice in this source, are not checked, I tremble for the fate of our country." It would also stand as something of a landmark case, if for no other reason than being the last case in England tried under the old 16th century principles, in which the accused had to defend themselves against the prosecution, and were only allowed to speak once after all evidence was given against them. They were also not allowed to cross-examine witnesses, so as you can see, it was hardly a fair trial, not helped by neither John or Joseph having legal counsel with them. It was not something that William Probert would have to worry about, though. He had been able to get himself immunity, on the condition he turned King's evidence against the others for the crime, something he was more than happy to do. During the questioning, Joseph Hunt had also been very willing to help with the investigation, but something like immunity was not extended to him. He was standing trial as well. There's really not much to say about his time before the judge. The only moment that stands out was when being asked about the events after the murder and what they did the rest of the evening, and especially the fact they all had a meal together. He was asked, was the supper postponed? To which he replied, no, it was pork, which is reported to have led to a great amount of laughter in the courtroom at the time. If Joseph Hunt was able to find a certain amount of humour while in the courtroom, John Thurtell certainly was not able to. He stood alone against the accusations, defending himself constantly, and in fact was doing pretty well, even seemingly in the eyes of many in the court, pushing blame onto the other two, before the old self-obsessed John reared his head again, and rather than keeping things short, he started to ramble on and on, talking about his good, decent Christian upbringing, his military service, and making references to philosophers such as Voltaire, until he was called on to stop by the judge. It was also complained the case was brought to court far earlier than he was ready for, and many of his witnesses had not turned up in time. The ones they were able to get, though, turned out to be pretty abysmal. One stating they believed he was innocent because John Thurtell was a gentleman. When asked what made him a gentleman, all the witness could reply was, he kept a gig, and that rather set the tone for the rest of it. Even though, as everything crumbled around him, John never admitted his guilt in the courtroom, holding out that he was innocent until the bitter end. When all was said and done, the jury were sent away to make their verdict, and returned 20 minutes later. John was found guilty of the murder, and Joseph was found guilty as his accomplice. They were both condemned to hang, the date being set for 3 days later, on the 9th of January 1824. And then, to make matters worse, they were to be autonomised, dissected to help the ever-changing world of medicine, a process brought in to cut down on the number of body snatchers stealing from churchyards, but also served a double purpose. Due to the conflict between the church and the world of science, anyone who'd been sentenced to this was barred from being buried in consecrated ground, and seen as an affront to Christianity. And as promised, due to the evidence given, William Probert walked away that day, a free man. The night before the pair were set to die, there would be a reprieve for Joseph Hunt. It was not uncommon at the time that certain death sentences would be commuted if the party had seemed to be not playing the main role in the crime or was young. In this case, it was likely due to him not taking part in the killing itself. So rather than facing a short drop on the noose, John would now face the long voyage around the world, as his punishment was now transportation to Australia. But for John there would be no way out. The downward spiral of his life had led him to this end. The hanging was to be done by James Foxon, assisted by Thomas Cheshire, who had come from London a couple of days before to make his preparations and see that everything was working with the gallows. The hanging was set for 12 noon on the 9th, so shortly before, the prison bell began to toll, and John was led out of the prison to the gallows, and the awaiting crowd of around 15,000 who had come to see justice done. John was dressed smartly, and very much in line with his dandy ways, and was described as elegantly attired in a brown greatcoat, with a black velvet collar, light breeches and gaiters, with a fashionable waistcoat with gilt buttons. He was escorted to the hangman by the prison governor, chief warden, and the prison chaplain, who was reading out the burial service as they walked along with a group of soldiers armed with sticks and pikes, to keep the crowd back away from him. John prayed as he walked. It was a short walk from the prison to the gallows that had been built just outside its doors. A large wooden frame, 8 feet high, 30 feet long, and 15 feet deep, with a box underneath for the body to fall into, out of the sight of the public. The whole thing had been painted black, giving it what was described as a very gloomy appearance. Reaching the 5 steps up to the gallows, he paused for a moment, and finally confessed his guilt, this to the chaplain, allegedly saying, "I am quite satisfied. I forgive the world. I die in peace and charity with all mankind. I admit that justice has been done to me." After this he made his way up, not needing to be forced at all. Reaching the top of the platform, Foxon took control of him, placing his hands in front of him in handcuffs, removing his cravat and loosening his collar while John finished praying. When John was finished, the white bag was placed over his head and the noose around his neck. While Foxon made his final adjustments, the prison governor and warden came forward to say goodbye to John, both shaking hands, with one of them saying, "Goodbye, Mr. Thurtell. May God Almighty bless you." To which John replied, "God bless you, Mr. Wilson. God bless you." With the pleasantries and formalities done, everyone took their places, and 2 minutes past 12 the signal was given by the sheriff, Mr. Nicholson, and the bolts were removed. And with that, John Thurtell took his final fall, through the trapdoor and into oblivion. The drop killed him instantly. It was said the sound of his neck breaking was like a pistol shot. Although it has been claimed this was either embellishment to sell more papers around what was a very popular case, or simply confusion, and the sound was simply the trapdoor hitting the wooden frame as it opened. As was customary, he was left hanging for an hour to ensure his death, before being cut down, and his body sent to Surgeons' Hall in London to be dissected. He was 29 years old. What became of his body afterwards is unknown. His family had hoped it would be returned to Norwich, where they could have tried to have some sort of burial for it, even in non-consecrated ground. But this was not to be. It's possible that it still resides somewhere in the Royal Archives of the College of Surgeons. The killer of William Weir had faced justice, but what of his 2 friends so fast to turn on him and each other when the time came? Joseph Hunt would come out on top of this whole situation, and actually benefited from his transportation. After serving his time in Botany Bay, he was granted his freedom and chose to stay in Australia, settling in Bathurst, New South Wales, where he married a doctor's widow and raised a son and a daughter, even finding work as a police constable of all things, before passing away as a well-respected member of his community in 1861, and still has descendants in the country to this day. As for William Probert, who left them both in the noose to save his own skin, well, he would have a far shorter and much unhappier life. Although cleared of his role in the killing, his name had still been heavily publicised attached to it, and he soon found himself an outcast from much of society. Unable to find decent work, he turned again to the criminal world. But even there, most wanted nothing to do with him due to his betrayal. In 1825, in need of money to feed him and his wife, he stole a horse from a relative, hoping to be able to sell it on. He was caught. This time he would stand trial and was found guilty. He was then sentenced to hang. It was carried out on the 20th of June, 1825 in Newgate Prison. He was 33 years old at the time, and the hangman was none other than James Foxon. The death of John also did little in the way to act as a final warning to his brother Thomas. He carried on his poor financial ways and ended up serving another full 3 years in prison for fraud. The Radlett murder, as it became to be known, would leave a lasting mark on the country for a time, shining a light on the criminal underworld that many were largely ignorant to, and leading to many wanting more done to stamp this sort of thing out. The site of the killing, and other areas mentioned, became hotspots for tourists. Among those who came to visit was the Scottish historian Sir Walter Scott. John would be mentioned in many literary works over the time. 17 books were written just about the murder itself. And he would appear in Thomas de Quincey's satirical 1827 work on murder considered as one of the fine arts. And Thomas Braddington Macaulay wrote, "There is a possibility that Thurtell may have killed Weir only in order to give every youth of England an impressive warning against gaming and bad company." The murder also played the focal point of many stage plays that toured the country for a time. One of his longest-lasting legacies, though, would be a waxwork displayed in Madame Tussauds Chamber of Horrors for over 150 years. Gills Hill Lane, now a quiet suburban road near the outskirts of an ever-growing city of London, was for a time also nicknamed Murder Lane. In Norwich the case was followed with great interest, and as you can imagine, some were wondering why his father Thomas had seemingly done nothing to help his son. These doubts were soon put to bed by letters, one from the Sheriff of Hertfordshire and one from a local resident, the same Mr. Bolingbroke, who John had claimed to be going to visit the day he was mugged. It may appear to some that he, the father, has not acted with significant kindness of feeling towards his unhappy son. You may be rest assured, sir, that there was no point of his conduct which could not be satisfactorily explained. He was generally acting upon the advice of Mr. Unthank, a respectable solicitor in this city, my own and others. There are many actions in a man's life of which no correct opinion can be formed, without the knowledge of the motives by which such have been influenced. It would appear, though, that having one son a hanged murderer, and the other one in prison for fraud, would do little to damage the reputation of Thomas Thurtell in the city, as he was elected mayor only a few months after John was hanged, a position he would hold until 1829. Others in the Thurtell family, though, were not so happy to carry on a connection with it, with many changing their names, and others emigrating as far away as America, Australia, and South Africa to avoid the shame. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All of the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Please, feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. And if you want, please follow the channel's Instagram account, a link to which can be found both on my profile here and in the description below this video. This was The Fall of John Thurtell, the Radlett murderer, and this was a little bit of history.